Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel W.K. Lee. I'm the author of Anatomy of Want and a New Orleans-based poet. Um, we are doing a little interview series for Saints and Sinners Literary Festival, and I'm super excited and honored to be able to interview Chen Chen, um, who is also going to be the judge for the Saints and Sinners Poetry Contest, I believe. How are you doing today?
Good, I'm well. Yeah, been just working pretty much the whole morning, just had some lunch. How about you?
Pretty good. I have just kind of gotten to the tail end of a dual battle of shingles and viral meningitis, um, and I survived to do this.
I'm glad you're
Which is
okay.
really great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, why don't we just dive in? Because I'm really excited to hear some of the stories, the questions I'm going to answer or ask, that is, you're going to answer. um, why don't you tell me a little bit about the first poem, if you remember it, the first poem you ever wrote?
The first poem I ever wrote. Um, I don't know if I remember it super in detail or anything, but um I mean, it was probably in elementary school for some kind of class assignment. And I remember also in eighth grade, in middle school, we had a unit on Robert Frost, which just is very appropriate for having grown up in New England. So like Frost and Dickinson. Um, we lived in Amherst in Western Mass. So Dickinson's house wasn't that far away. One of the libraries at Amherst College is like the Frost Library. Um, so that was kind of the literary environment that I was surrounded with. So already kind of these really big canonical American figures. And so we had this unit on Frost, and I remember doing all these imitations of Frost poems. And at the time, feeling very proud of myself, especially when my teacher, my English teacher, praised those imitations. Um, I don't know if they still have them somewhere. I might be too embarrassed to look back on it. But I think I can, I mean, at this point, forgive myself, my eighth grade self for whatever kind of amateur attempts I made. But yeah, that's sort of immediately what comes to mind with that question, those frost imitations. Yeah.
I think you mentioned in an earlier interview that Dickinson was kind of an early influence with your writing. Who else has been really important in terms of your kind of your early craft or your early practice and now? And what did you learn from each of those writers?
Yeah, actually, yeah, I reference both Frost and Dickinson in my second book, my latest book, Your Emergency Contact Has Experienced an Emergency, because I was looking back, I was reflecting on that legacy kind of early on in my life before I really understood how important these figures were and kind of how they factor into contemporary writing. But they're kind of these larger than life, like alongside my parents, these like authority figures in my life. And so I have some work in the new book that navigates my relationship to them as a writer now versus in my youth. But yeah, there are so many early influences. A lot of it actually, I'm very influenced by television. Um, and at one point thought I would become a TV writer, and maybe at some point, if conditions improve in that writing landscape, which I don't know, I hope it does. But yeah, so maybe I still will someday. But yeah, early on, I mean, I watched a lot of TV, probably too much. I would say like from middle school into high school, it's very obsessed with Buffy the Vampire Slayer and the kind of um, mashup of genres that that show is. So like horror and action, comedy, drama, all of that can happen sometimes within the same scene. And I love that kind of mix and quick changes in tone. And I think especially the humor parts from that show, I'm still influenced by in my own writing and the kind of pop culture references that that show is known for making. That also seeps into my own work. But in terms of other poets, I'll just mention a couple from early on in high school in particular, when I started to read more poetry and on my own, like outside of class. And at this point, my family had moved to the Boston area. We were in Newton, Massachusetts, and there's a really fantastic public library there, the Newton Free Library, with an amazing poetry selection, like often better, I would say, than a lot of other libraries or bookstores, or sometimes you might get like one bookcase, like 5 shelves at most. But this selection at the library in Newton had a really expansive and contemporary collection. So it was very up to date. And so I remember just starting at the beginning of the alphabet because I really didn't know where to go. And I remember my sophomore English teacher, shout out to Miss Kish, had made some suggestions. I remember we were reading William Stafford and Leon Lee. I remember her recommending. It was actually, I think, the first time I came across work by another Asian American poet and a contemporary poet. And so that was really meaningful. I remember starting at the beginning of the alphabet with Margaret Atwood, and really not knowing anything about her. So I think I first experienced her work in poetry, even though she's much better known for fiction, right? Handmaid's Tale. But she, I think, started out as a poet. So that was her first genre, maybe like her first love as a writer. So it feels kind of special to start there. I was immediately drawn to her work, I think, for the emotional immediacy, and that became really important to me as I continued to write. So I was writing fiction. I'd always loved telling stories, writing stories, and I started to write more and more poetry. And I think part of that came out of um, being closeted and not being able to really talk about who I was in terms of my sexuality. And so I turned to the page, and that was an outlet. That was a space in which I felt like I could reveal things or get more vulnerable, even just with myself, and admit things to myself or start exploring things that I wasn't ready to in other areas of my life. And so I'd say poetry, whether it was by like queer authors or not. I also remember reading Mark Doty, like at some point, maybe when I got to the D's in the alphabet. But I think I also started like researching. I would just like look up, LGBTQ writers, poets. So it became a more targeted research program as I went on, kind of random initially. But yeah, whether they're queer or not, it was really important to me that emotional immediacy and depth that you could get from a poem, within the first couple of lines, right? It already felt like something really urgent was being shared by the speaker of that poem. And so that increasingly appealed to me, invited me in to read more poetry.
You mentioned those two things, emotional intimacy immediacy, and depth, are those kind of two features that you are particularly drawn to in poetry that kind of transcend maybe even stylistic differences?
Absolutely. I think that's probably the number one thing that I look for. And intimacy is a great word for it as well. Um, I'm kind of looking for or listening for, um, depending on how I'm receiving the poem, whether it's on the page or hearing someone read it. Um, every time I'm looking for that spark of connection, which doesn't mean that I have to be able to relate to the subject matter. I don't think that's as important as um, what the language pulls me in to pay attention to, right? Does it kind of um, grab hold of me and on that emotional level? So yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I think that is true across stylistic differences. So there's a lot of different types of poetry that I love, from different historical periods as well, um, by many different writers who lived very different lives from the one I live. Um, but I think there is something in common in terms of that urgency and that need. I want to feel like the voice in the poem is a real one, like a living one, whether the author is still alive or not. But their voice survives them, and that's what I'm drawn to.
For sure. I think even for myself that I can look over, so to speak, stylistic differences, but if I'm still left cold after reading
Yeah,
something, then
yeah.
I'm immediately going to kind of like probably just forget the poem.
Hmm.
You know, I I just want to kind of bring up this really kind of marvelous statement that you made in describing your poetry in a single sentence. Again, this was an interview with Wildness. You said, "Please share these chicken tenders with me on this big green sofa." That was your one sentence describing your poetry, which I think kind of just tickles at what is so really compelling about your writing. That is this kind of profound levity. Um, it's often a kind of lightness that leads to discovery. Is this kind of like an intentional process, or is this just how your voice seems to consistently and habitually manifests itself on the page?
Yeah, it's definitely a process. I wouldn't say it's something like I didn't wake up like that, you know, and immediately this very inviting or jovial person or voice. It's definitely I need to go with that metaphor, I guess, but it's also kind of literal. Like I'm not a morning person. I wake up in a very grouchy manner usually, and it takes me a good like hour or so to just adjust to being back in the waking world every time I feel, even if I've slept like a long time, sometimes it's worse. It's too long. I just feel yanked out of, this peaceful realm of my internal rest. And so it's always an adjustment to be back in the world. So yeah, I think it's the same with working on poems. I don't usually start off even being that like enthusiastic about the prospect of working on a poem. I think it's incredibly difficult and daunting. Um, and I think it might be surprising for some people to hear this, but I think it becomes more challenging in some ways the more you write, the longer you write, because you're also trying not to repeat yourself. You're trying not to write exactly the same poem that you have before. Of course, everything you write is going to have like your stamp of personality on it. And your sort of signature imagination, which is a really beautiful thing. Those idiosyncratic individual qualities of the work you make. But at the same time, you're like, how do I not just start and end in the same ways, or pull the same moves every time? How can I make this dance, so to speak, different enough each time that also keeps you engaged, right? As a creative person who's trying to kind of grow and keep discovering things from the act of making something. So yeah, I think it's always a process. And to me, that's also what I'm most moved by, I think, in reading poems. When I talk about that emotional immediacy, I think a thing, or one version of that that really appeals to me is when someone's moving toward joy, or moving toward a place of a deeper understanding about their own life or about the world around them, but they don't start there, right? They don't start happy. They don't start, um, like they know things, right? They sort of start, I think, in a very unknown place, a very uncertain place. And it's not that by the end it's certain, right? That's completely resolved. But I think it's that attempt to move toward some discovery, some surprise, some unexpected joy that really moves me. And in fact, yeah, I was trying for a while to be the opposite of that in my writing. Like at the beginning of grad school, I was really trying to be such a serious and also very minimal poet. But over time, I realized that that was kind of putting on this costume that didn't fit me at all. I was like, why are all these poems kind of these pale imitations of things I loved reading? And initially, it was kind of a bummer to discover that I couldn't write exactly like some of the people that I love reading, someone like Atwood or Louise Glück or Lucille Clifton, people who write these much more spare kind of styles a lot of the time, and have these really kind of devastating, plain-spoken moments. So it took me a while to realize that that wasn't really my voice, because it wasn't rooted in something in my own life, including my own inner life. So yeah, that was a whole process to figure out, oh, if I start writing more like how I talk, especially with friends, with people that I'm close to, then there's something much more lively in the language that starts to come across. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You just kind of think helps also to hear that even on the entering grad school, you're still kind of discovering or recalibrating your voice, whatever that means, and that one should be a little bit kind of patient about what their voice is, and accept that it will change. And I don't like this kind of like authenticity porn thing that I think we have in our like general mainstream discourse about our lives. Um, this kind of growth and self-patience, I think, is important. Especially when we kind of think of like how impatient that I think we are as a culture, or achievement
Definitely.
might be. Kind of speaking of language, you were an 1.5 generation immigrant, as I was, who grew up in a multilingual home. Do you have any particular or even broad feelings about expressing yourself in poetry in a kind of in like the non-English language or languages that have circulated in your life? I noticed in your second book, and your emergency contact has experience or had experience of emergency. You write a poem, one particular poem that's entirely in Chinese, not translated, which I love. as well. Um, and I got me thinking of like, what does it mean for me to be able to, if I could at this point, uh, write in write in Chinese, or even colloquially translate my thoughts and feelings into Cantonese. So kind of all that to say, like, what did it really mean to you to kind of be able to do this, and or in general to kind of express yourself in this poetic mode in non-English?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm glad you brought up um, authenticity and being critical of it, because I also have a bone to pick with that term, which I think can actually be really stifling. And I think in a lot of literary discourse, the way that authenticity gets used is kind of, it's like a code word for actually like the white gaze or the dominant narrative, because it has, I think it carries this expectation for marginalized writers or writers of color to perform a racial or ethnic identity on the page that is a very palatable, um, immediate, and like consumable identity, um, which really shrinks the whole canvas that we're working on, I think. And so for a while, I really avoided using Chinese in my work, even though I was like, that's something that I could do, and I dabbled in it here and there. I think there's like one poem in my first chapbook, Set the Garden on Fire, from like 2015, which feels like a million years ago now with, you know, the pandemic just warping the sense of time. Even though like in the grand scheme of things, it's not that long ago, but it also feels like very old work to me at this point. So I think there's like one poem where I use like one Chinese term in it, and even then that felt like I don't know if it would come across like that to a reader, but to me, looking back on it, it feels a little gimmicky. Like, oh, let me use this word and kind of circle around it and think about what it means. Um, but and there are poems that do that, I think, really well, other people. But yeah, I don't think I really knew how to do it for a while. And I didn't want to do it in a reductive way or in a kind of self-exoticizing way of like, oh, look at this foreignness, even though it's like not foreign to me. And so I think what was really important was to get to a place where I felt like I could write in some multilingual way that wasn't self-alienating at the same time. Like I'm performing this as an identity for like a non-Chinese speaker or reader. And it's like meant for them to consume it, rather than coming from a place where also as a reader myself, I feel like I could look at the work again and feel like, oh no, this is a place that I'm inhabiting, and it's not just sort of um, produced for someone else who doesn't have the same understanding. I think also for a long time I was nervous about not being like fluent enough, even though it's like a language that I've spoken growing up. But my spoken ability is much better than my written ability. And so that also felt like a limitation until I just started to feel like I'm cutting myself off from the chance to explore something more fully. You know, if this is my linguistic reality, like this is what I grew up speaking, it's still how I speak, like with my parents, with my brothers, going back and forth a lot between Mandarin and English, then why not write in that language? So it just felt like, oh, why am I keeping myself from that? And so I just started to embrace the fact that I'm not an authority, I'm not like an ambassador, nor do I want to be. And so it just came from the place of more like, no, this is the regular everyday language that my family uses. And so it's stuff like, uh, sofa, I think, which is also like a loan word in Mandarin, shafa. So at one point, I have a poem that uses that. And there's another one that uses like pizza, or like it switches back and forth between like Mandarin and English pizza. Um, things like that, which aren't maybe like for a non-Chinese audience, the first thing you would think of, speaking Chinese or some form of it. But that's how we used it, is to talk about our everyday lives, um, and talk about, work and green cards, but also movies and what we're reading, what we're, just thinking about on a daily basis. And so even like the level of that language is not very sophisticated, right? It's not like what you would find in a novel written in Chinese, or, in the news. Um, it's like maybe second, third grade Mandarin at best. But that's like what we use. Like, you use what you have to communicate, to be able to share your thoughts with other people. And I think I used to be very self-conscious about that. And I was also worried about making mistakes. And I'm like, there are probably, grammatical mistakes or vocabulary mistakes, but those are mine, And so to me, that became the priority. It was much more important, to recognize the language that I actually spoke, instead of this kind of flat, abstract idea of authenticity that's like very performative, of like, let me, show you this culture. I'm like, no, it's not about that. It's about engaging the linguistic reality that I've actually lived. Yeah.
It's really interesting because I think that in a way what you're saying is also kind of like allowing yourself to write in Chinglish.
Yeah.
That is the kind of thing that, and I am very sympathetic to, but like I noticed that it's I don't think it's a necessarily a barrier with other kinds of writers. I've definitely have read other Latin American or Chicano
Yeah.
writers who definitely kind of use Spanish and English in their writers, and there's a kind of a more of a maybe a liberty, and that might also have to do with kind of something outside of the writing, right? Like this poetry as cultural product that goes into the market, and then if you want to be read, like those kinds of dynamics of like how does your poetry find an audience, and those
Mm.
levels
Mhm.
of of um, asserting itself into into reading really. Um, excuse me. Uh, I'd like to just kind of turn really, just a little swerve, we'll say, that's kind of related to like Chinese and expressing yourself in Chinese. You kind of you've revealed in both of your books kind of how you have this very complicated relationship with your family, particularly your mother, when it comes to your queerness. And you said that, especially in the case of When I Grow Up, I Want to Be a List of Further Possibilities, that you really wrote for a queer Chinese American audience. Thinking about those two things, um, how important was it to you or your parents to read your work? And even if they had a limited understanding of it. And did the expectation change with your second book?
Yeah. I mean, I think first of all, even though like I have that particular audience in mind, um, I don't feel like I don't want to claim like I'm representing a whole group, because I just think that's impossible, and that's not really my aim anyway. Um, and so my hope is that it's engaging for people who might share, right, some of those identifiers or some of those experiences. But of course, we're all quite different from one another too. But yeah, the family question. I don't know how much they have read. I mean, they have both books, but they don't really bring it up. So I think awkward at times because I do depict them in very complicated and sometimes just unflattering ways, but I think I depict myself similarly. So it's not always, you know, like they're the bad guys or anything. And I think there are things that come across about how much I admire them too. Um, and so I hope, yeah, that there's a lot of care that's conveyed in that depiction, because I'm very like aware of especially a non Chinese audience um, interpreting in a more reductive or stereotypical way, especially when it comes to my parents' homophobia. And there's a poem that sort of addresses this in the second book as well, where there's a memory of talking to a white teacher in high school who made this very disparaging and like casual remark about my parents just being backwards people. And that really angered me. Obviously, I still think about it. Um, is that's not how I want them to be seen or to come across that way. And I think it's more that, like anyone, right, there are certain gaps in knowledge or experience that, you know, they come to, but I don't want to be essentialist about their attitudes and say, oh, this is like a Chinese thing, because I know plenty of Chinese people who are not homophobic and are not like intensely so in the ways that they've been. Um, and yeah, there's of course a huge range of um, perspectives and political beliefs when it comes to you know, Chinese nationals and also the Chinese diaspora. Um, and so yeah, I hope that that is clear in the writing as well. But yeah, I think with the first book, I would say they um, probably haven't said as much about it because it's so like such a well-worn topic in our family. We've talked ad nauseum about those years because a lot of those poems are about my early adolescence or childhood. So it's kind of further in the past. And there's some things that we have worked through to some extent already. Whereas the second book is much more recent, definitely from a more adult perspective. And so I think those are things we're like actively talking about and working through. So I think that's kind of more awkward to bring up in a sense, or maybe it's like too close in a way, like you don't need the poem to refer to it. It's like still happening. Um, but it's also something that I've thought about and written about a little bit, is just the effect of publishing this work. And I think certainly after the first book, there are certain things that my parents have realized, like maybe there's a better way for us to talk about this, or we need to take a step back from arguing about it so much. And I've also realized things that I've needed to change in my relationship with them after that first book was published. And so now I would say, like, there's certain boundaries that I've set up around how they talk about certain things. And I just feel more capable of doing that, being older and having written some of this work. But I'm also happy to say that what I'm working on now has less to do with family because I have, yeah, gone to that well so many times. um, I mean, I'm sure I'm going to circle back in some ways, but at least right now, I'm kind of in other terrain. Yeah.
So it's kind of become less important, I guess, that they read it or even understand it as you've kind of
Yeah. I was just
reconciled
like,
your relationship.
yeah. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. I'm with my family, even my siblings. I don't expect them to read it
Yeah,
or
I
even
don't
have it,
expect
frankly.
them to read it. They've wanted to, like they've asked for the books. But I don't know how much they really like read it, or it's so much as like it's kind of like it's proof, it's an object
Yeah.
that sort of says like, oh, you are doing the writing thing, because it's not something they've um really understood for a long time. You're like, why is this what you want to do? Or like, what does that mean? What does it look like? So I think for it's a way for them, maybe more so than like understanding the writing itself, to be able to say like, oh yeah, no, he's a writer.
Oh,
He's a
I totally agree. I think for a long time, my mom, I think I tried to explain what I was doing for my MFA, telling people that I was studying journalism.
yeah, right, like the closest thing that they're familiar with. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Like, oh, okay. And when the book came out, I was like, well, here you go. This is what all that money went to.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Um, uh, I just have a couple questions left. Do you have any insights from your experience that you'd like to offer new writers, or just discovering poetry, um, and figuring out what poetry means to them?
Yeah, I think it's really important to find writing community and writer friends, not just for feedback, but that can be really valuable. Like I do have close poet friends that I share drafts, work in progress with. Um, but more often, it's just to vent, to complain. um, being a writer, whether it's, the drafting process itself or submitting work, publishing work, navigating grad school, or, your career, whether that involves teaching or, being outside of academia. So all of these different aspects of the writing life, I think it's important to have some people around you or people that you can call up, get on FaceTime, and talk about what's bothering you. Because there's going to be so many things. I guess that's the point that I make. Um, there'll be plenty to complain about. And I think I mean, you can do that on Twitter. Plenty of people do that sometimes myself. But I think it's really nice to talk to um, people that you have a closer relationship with who are also going through some similar things. So you can, share in that and help each other or just listen to each other. Because I think the writing itself can already be such a lonely endeavor, right? So you're just sitting at a desk or at a table for hours on end, if you're kind of lucky to have that time, staring at your screen or into a journal, right, and trying to make these like worlds out of words. So, um, and that solitude can be really wonderful. I think you can't really be a writer without enjoying something about that solitude, because it's going to be like your life for a good portion. But when you kind of emerge from that cave of your writing, I think, yeah, you should have some people that you can talk to um, about your work, but also about, yeah, what you're concerned about, what you're doubting or questioning, and also people to celebrate with. It's not all complaint, but you hit certain milestones, you publish a book or you get to read your poetry somewhere that's exciting. all of those things. It's also, you want people to celebrate with. Yeah.
You brought up concerns, and that's kind of a good segue to this a little bit more political question. I'm gonna give you with a little bit about me, kind of my personal way of trying to move writers and readers towards a more kind of just literary landscape is to kind of platform other queer BIPOC poets, and I usually just kind of read a piece of their work before my own reading, so then I can expose my audience to a queer BIPOC poet they've never kind of heard of. Pretty convinced, or I'm pretty convinced that as minoritized writers, that we kind of raise the floor for all of us, especially for undiscovered voices, giving them an opportunity to be seen and heard. I'm also really very deeply cautious about falling into kind of a rat race for acknowledgement and accolades, particularly with other BIPOC writers, let alone queer BIPOC writers. But at the same time, I think there's a problem if the kind of mainstream world kind of only knows or thinks of really wonderful writers, but if they're kind of, for all their diversity motivated listicles, they're only going to think of like Ocean Vuong, Alex Chi, and Hanya Nagara, all of who I think are fantastic. They're not really kind of doing the work, and then we're not doing the work by kind of elevating, like I said, like the floor to make sure other queer BIPOC writers are kind of giving us some limelight. All that to say is, do you have your own kind of, let's call it like a justice practice when it comes to the world of poetry, or outside of writing it?
Yeah, I try to be very conscious of not like, I try not to reproduce a kind of scarcity model in the literary world where it's like only a handful of people get to shine. And so that's really important to me when, a lot of things that I do, from judging contests. So when I read for like book contests, or I'm on panels for fellowships or grant funding, and also when I edit magazines. Edit this Twitter-based journal, the Lickety Splits, and also co-edit this online poetry journal, Underblong, although we've been kind of on a hiatus because we've all been so busy. But I'm looking forward to getting back to that. So with those projects, it's really important to me to publish voices, like newer voices, or at least voices that I myself am less familiar with and haven't seen as much, like people who don't have books out, or haven't published that much in journals either. So that's really exciting to me and meaningful to give them a platform, like an early one, alongside people who might be more established in one way or another. And I think it's important to keep in mind too, like a variety of these measures of success, because I think it's important not to kind of overemphasize the same milestones of like, oh, you should get this prize or this kind of fellowship, or go to this residency or do this retreat, because I just think it creates a lot of unnecessary pressure, either for younger writers or writers who are coming up, whatever, the age may be, to like follow this one path. And and I just don't think that that's useful to subscribe to. So most talking with students as well about like, well, what opportunities are actually meaningful to you? You know, like, is this a funding opportunity that's meaningful for your work, for who you are, for your community? Or is this something like if you don't get it, and it's always disappointing not to get money, especially, of course. But I think it's also can be useful or healthy to think about it in terms of, okay, but what does that actually do for you? What does it actually mean for you in the long run? And is there like a more meaningful opportunity? You know, or like the next time you apply for something, what do you want to communicate better? But it's also such a crapshoot a lot of the time, you know, be on both sides of this a lot now, whether it's applying or submitting, you know, work for something, you know, or being on the judging side or the panel side. I can see that, you know, it's incredibly subjective, especially for like a book prize, right? Where it's like one judge at the end. I think, I mean, this is like a larger conversation, but the test system is deeply flawed, right? Because you, like as a writer, you spend so much money submitting to these places, and then there's like one winner at the end, and it's sort of up to that final judge's taste, you know. And so you can be submitting so many rounds for years before, you know, something really happens. So yeah, there are things that I think really need to be addressed in terms of access. You know, in my own ways, I feel like it's important to me that the journals that I help run, you know, submissions are always free, contributors are paid. I mean, it's a small amount, but that matters to me. And I think a lot about, as I said, you know, whose voices get platformed, who hasn't had that opportunity yet. You know, so that does factor in to how I read submissions for those projects. Sure. I mean, that's what comes to mind right now. I
No,
like
that's
there.
great.
What?
No, that's great. Thank you for your candor.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when you start kind of traversing both things, or you're doing kind of both side work on the both sides, you know,
Yeah, and also say like sometimes I'll get asked to do something or like an opportunity comes my way that I feel um like someone else would benefit from it more, or like I've done something already. And so in that case, I would recommend someone else for that, or just, you know, tell them, you don't have to ask me, it's fine. um, so things like that. So I think that's important because it's a very like self-perpetuating kind of system that we have, where it's often, you know, people, um, you know, getting asked, like the same set of people getting asked to do these things, that comes with, you know, um, compensation and prestige and power, right? Because you're kind of shaping, you know, the next generation in some way. So I think it's really important to not always be the picker. It was something that D.A. Powell said to me like a while back, where he was talking about judging things. It's like, it's important not to be the picker all the time and to be aware.
yeah.
When have you picked too many things, right? Like you've put your sort of stamp on things because it is so subjective. So it's really good to acknowledge that, and there should be more range. Yeah.
I wholly agree, and I'm hoping other people heed what you just said too. I'm just gonna ask one last question. It's lighter fare. I know we're almost approaching an hour. But as a self-admitted television junkie, tell me what you're currently obsessed with And what is your all-time favorite television show?
Oh, yay, TV. Yeah. Um, yeah, I'm currently well, my partner and I, we've been watching the other two, the HBO comedy, um, that I think is fantastic. I think this season's like pretty good. Maybe, yeah, I enjoyed the previous two seasons more. But overall, I just think it's like very smart writing, and it really wrestles with some of the issues that come up with like queer representation, and what that means and how often it's like reduced to um, tokenizing, and again like performing a very, yeah, digestible kind of identity. Um, so I think it does a good job like exploring that while, telling a lot of jokes along the way. And also like this critique of celebrity culture in a bunch of ways. Um, yeah, so I love that show. Um, what else have I been watching? I mean, so much. There's like this, I mean, the genre of like BL, which I don't know, like a lot of people, know that there's like a growing audience for it in the US. This like boys love genre, which has
Yeah.
become really, really popular in Southeast Asia and East Asia. Yeah, there's this show, this Thai show, it's called Moonlight Chicken. Um, that came out recently. I think it's like 8 episodes. And that one I appreciate because like some of them are really silly, and I like some of the silly ones too. They're kind of an escape. They're meant to be. And I'm like, this just like is not realistic at all. But Moonlight Chicken, like at least I think it attempts greater realism than some of them. Because in some series it's like homophobia is like completely absent, and I'm just like, huh, I don't buy that. Um, or like there are like no real like relationship problems in the couples that get together. Like, okay, that's not real. Um, but in Moonlight Chicken, I feel like there is more conflict, and it's interesting because a lot of it is actually class conflict, which I feel like we don't see a lot of, especially in this genre, right? Like in the romance um, world. So I appreciate it for that, where like money is an issue to these characters. And yeah, a lot of tension comes from that, in how they see themselves, how other people perceive them based on class. Um, yeah, so an all-time favorite, I mean, I mentioned Buffy. What's another one? Oh, Battlestar Galactica.
Oh,
Uh,
thank God you said that.
yeah.
One of my favorites of all time. I'm not even a sci-fi junkie, but I think it's one of the best,
Yeah,
smartest, especially at the time, early
right.
aughts. That's
Yeah, because it's like, yeah, production values on it could be better, blah, blah, blah. But in terms of storytelling, in terms of like its exploration of ethics, I
yes.
think it's really compelling
Mm.
because it really goes places and makes you, yeah, ask, I think, much tougher questions. Um, yeah, so yeah, that one.
And also went for like really interesting emotional places that I didn't expect it from the genre.
Yeah,
I remember
yeah,
completely crying this kind of because of the Adama has with his son with Apollo, and then there's these moments you're just like, wow, and
yeah.
yeah, it's an
Because
excellent.
yeah, pretty much like every character gets to be complicated and gets to
Yes.
make a complicated choice of some kind. And so it's not, yeah, one-sided or like you're just rooting for one kind of person all the time. Yeah, great.
Great. That's kind of all I have for today. I'm so happy to have spent this hour chatting with you and hearing your insights and your experiences. I hope the viewing audience also got a taste of that. And thank you again. And again, Chen Chen is the author of 2 books. The recent one is Your Emergency Contact Has Had an Emergency. And when I grow up, I want to be a list of possibilities, right?
Further possibilities. Yeah.
Further.
My titles are so long. I know. I'm like, it's a challenge. Every time you have to like remember this whole sentence. But yeah, thank you so much for these wonderful questions and conversation.
Thank you for taking the time.